Okay. So I'm Susan Ziegler. You guys all know this. We're an informal group. And here we also know the co-organizers, Heidi Brevik-Zender, Jonathan Eckert, of the Global 19th Century group at the Center for Ideas and Society. I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles, which is Tongva land. And also, I'm speaking to you during a strike, which I would like to express solidarity with. And nonetheless, we are holding this event. I think we felt that the benefit of holding it and recording it for possible, later consultation and viewing by graduate students was the value of that was greater than the symbolic value of canceling the talk. So I thank you for all being here and urge you to support the strike in other ways. So let's get down to business. We are so grateful that Lindsay Wilhelm, you are here. You are an assistant professor of English literature at Oklahoma State University. This is where Lindsay Wilhelm specializes in late 19th century British literature. She is writing two book projects, one on the intersection of the aesthetic movement and evolutionary science, the other on Victorian Hawaii in the period between Western contact and the annexation by the United States. And I think that the talk today is going to kind of bring both of those things together. Her work has been published in really fantastic 19th century British journals, Victorian Studies, Victorian Literature and Culture, 19th century literature, Literature Compass, and other journals and edited volumes. So her talk today for us is Development and Decadent Time in 19th Century Hawaii. So over to you, Lindsay.
All right, thank you. So before I jump into things, a couple things. I would say I have one book project and one thing that is an amorphous book project, right? So the Hawaii material is much more scattershot, right? So just to sort of get that out there, although I appreciate your vote of confidence, Susan. Thank you so much. So I also wanted to extend my thanks, right, to Susan, to everyone here, to the Global 19th Century Interdisciplinary Working Group, UCR's Center for Ideas and Society. Thank you for inviting me to be here, sort of here virtually with you all tonight. Like Susan, I also want to express my solidarity with the UC graduate student strike. I don't know if you mentioned it in your introduction, but I'm a UC alum myself. I went to UCLA. And when I was there, I was a very proud member of the UAW. And in fact, I think, Susan, you and I met at UCLA's 19th Century group. Is that correct? Right. When I was a graduate student there some time ago. It was it feels like a really long time ago. I guess it kind of was a long time ago. It's been so long, in fact, that I think it's fair to say that Victorian studies has undergone something of a revolution in its reorientation for the global. And as some of you may know, some of you here, some of you watching later, this global turn, I think, has been particularly robust in recent scholarship on decadence, in part because literary decadence has always been understood to be cosmopolitan in character. So this talk today comes from an essay that I wrote for a forthcoming special issue of the journal Volupte on global decadence. And for that reason, you might notice that the piece speaks to concerns specific to decadent studies, particularly ongoing conversations about how far we can or should expand the definition of decadence. But I hope the talk may also have something to say about the wider effort to decenter Britishness within our own discipline at large, and hopefully in a way that you might find provocative for your own work. And by you, I mean those of you who are here live and those of you who are watching later. So a couple things first, I am gonna type into chat, I've posted into chat a short glossary of a few Native Hawaiian terms that I will be using occasionally throughout the talk. They're really gonna come up mostly toward the end, and I will define them as I go along. But if I say something and it's unclear what that means, I've just left it in the chat. And now I'm gonna attempt to share my screen. Okay. And can you all see that? Yeah, and the volume's good? Okay, all right, thank you so much. So with that, I would begin in earnest by pointing out how the Hawaii of literary renown seems to exist outside the normal flow of time. The travel writer Charles Warren Stoddard, in his 1894 memoir, Hawaiian Life, Lazy Letters from Low Latitudes, recalls the beautiful, quote, boat boy of Lahaina, that's how he refers to this boy, in just such temporally ambiguous terms. Although Stoddard hadn't seen the native youth in years, he muses that the finger of time doubles up the moment it points toward him, so that this boy must still be lying in wait for me, not a day older, not a particle changed. But in writing about Hawaii, this pervasive trope of stasis often exists in uneasy counterpoise with alternative and contradictory models of time as cyclical, regressive, and even hyper-accelerated. Hawaiian history appears to unfold in fits and starts, jumping forward and looping backward in ways that trouble linear understandings of progress. Later in Hawaiian Life, for instance, Stoddard reflects on the fate of Kanepihi, a local fisherman who in the span of a few months transforms from a, quote, gentle savage into a streetwise petty thief. For Stoddard, Kanepihi's rapid evolution, which ends in with his ignominious death in prison, recreates in miniature the story of a race doomed to collapse under the weight of modernity and its steady drumbeat of development. As Robert Stilling, Matthew Patulski, Regina Gagne, and other scholars of global decadence have shown us, these evocations of a decadent or otherwise non-normative historical trajectory are not unique to the Pacific. Rather, they are characteristic of colonial cultures in the age of imperial decline. The essay from which this talk derives sets out to expand our understanding of this global decadence by situating historiography about and from Hawaii vis-a-vis what Stilling, in his study of post-colonial anti-decadence, describes as the temporality of empire. In doing so, I'm particularly indebted to Patulski and Gagne, who conceive of decadence not as a shared set of artistic values, that is, decadence as practiced among the coteries of fin de siècle London and Paris, but rather as a stance, and that's Patulski's term, a stance bred out of the friction of global modernization. This more expansive view of decadence, as I'll suggest, allows us to recognize the diffuser decadent discourses surrounding Hawaii in the later 19th century, when the islands were not only associated with the quintessentially decadent affects of indolence and ennui, but also seemed to typify the forces of geopolitical modernity. And very quickly, and I know we've had a few people join us, the rest of the talk will be structured into 3 parts. So first, I'm going to discuss briefly what I mean by decadent time in this context, and how Hawaii's nonconformity to the expected ambit of history found Western literary expression in decadent motifs and idioms. Then I'll return to this book, Stoddard's Hawaiian Life, in order to suggest how, in this case, decadence informs an anti-colonial critique. Finally, I'll turn to a small subset of Kanaka Maoli, which is Native Hawaiian historiography, written in Olelo Hawaii, which is the Hawaiian language. I want to consider how this work might be animated by overlapping, but nonetheless separate notions of decadent time, revealing commitments and concerns unique to a still independent nation under the duress of colonialism. By way of conclusion, I'll suggest how Hawaii presents a kind of interesting test case for the global turn in Victorian studies, one that demonstrates the limits as well as the possibilities of our discipline's expanding ken. And also welcome to those of you who've joined us. From its earliest iterations in 18th century accounts of the Roman Empire, decadence has been a vexed concept in post-Enlightenment historiography. On the one hand, decadence lends structure to history by codifying a messy confluence of events into linear causal sequence. On the other hand, the prospect of decadence looms menacingly behind the doctrines of progress and human perfectibility, threatening as it does the inevitable collapse of every civilization, no matter how rationally constructed. The 19th century advent of evolutionary anthropology only amplified this tension. And this sort of gets to what Susan was referring to in her introduction, how this kind of merges two of my research interests, which are Victorian Pacific, but also kind of post-Darwinian science. Without getting too far into the weeds today, I'd like to call attention to one aspect of that field, to one aspect of that evolutionary anthropology, namely the theory of the social organism, which held that societies arose, developed, and decayed in a manner akin to the single organism. This so-called organic analogy allowed anthropologists to locate the cultures they studied on a sliding scale of development, keyed also to the individual life cycle, ranging from primitive childhood to civilized adulthood to decadent old age. The organic analogy in turn lent scientific credibility to the assumption that contemporary non-white peoples were stuck at the same level of development as children and ancient Europeans. And this assumption was virtually omnipresent in Western depictions of indigeneity. Take, for example, Nathaniel Bright Emerson's unwritten literature of Hawaii, a lay history of Hawaiian music and dance published in 1909 under the imprimatur of the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology. In the preface to his book, Emerson sets out to prove that savages are only children of a younger growth than ourselves. What we find them to have been, we ourselves, in our ancestors, once were. He reiterates this again some pages later when he compares the pre-contact Hawaiian mindset to the, quote, unconscious naivete of a child, which harkens back to a period that was close to the world's infancy. For Emerson, a Hawaii-born supporter of annexation, this approach is patently strategic. And just to clarify, Emerson was born in Hawaii, but he was of missionary extraction. So he was definitely not Native Hawaiian, as you can probably tell. Emerson's temporalized racial hierarchy situates contemporary indigeneity, peoples, practices, and beliefs that persisted despite efforts to stamp them out in a precursory position within a progressive historical trajectory. This trajectory leads inevitably to US imperial hegemony. In this light, the American takeover of Hawaii is not the result of concerted colonial policy, but rather the happy culmination of evolutionary destiny, in which the backward native is integrated into the linear time of an enlightened empire on the rise. This might have appeared a safe enough presumption to Emerson in 1909, writing over a decade after the US had annexed Hawaii in 1898. But for most of the 19th century, the question of whether Hawaii would maintain its independence or be taken over by one of the colonial powers was far from settled. Its fate was made more uncertain by its unique sociopolitical circumstances. Hawaii was and is distinct from other Pacific Island groups for a number of reasons that have bearing on its perceived place within a racial hierarchy. Until the forced abdication of its last queen in 1893, the Hawaiian kingdom was an independent constitutional monarchy. It had a sophisticated governmental infrastructure, an extensive education system, a robust multilingual periodical press, a sprawling global network of consulates and embassies, and a richly cosmopolitan national culture. According to the evolutionary anthropology of the time, the kingdom was thus more or less on par with the constitutional monarchies of Europe, and Native Hawaiians among the most, quote, advanced non-Western peoples. At the same time, however, almost every Anglo-American observer remarks on the island's seeming resistance to progress, often articulating its allure through allusions to Alfred Tennyson's 1832 poem, The Lotus Eaters. Comparisons between the island of the indolent lotus eaters, a land where all things always seemed the same, and Hawaii, with its mild climate and purportedly slow pace of life, are commonplace to the point of cliche. And I found this sort of just recently. It's not a super recent article, it's from 2007, but it is a New York Times article about, I believe, a yoga retreat on the Hana Coast on Maui. And the title of the article is In the Land of the Lotus Eaters. So I thought it was fairly striking to see how persistent, right, the stereotype is. So this view of Hawaii as a decadent space, the land of the lotus eaters, dovetailed, moreover, with the widespread presumption that Kanaka Maoli, like all indigenous peoples, were on the brink of extinction. As Patrick Brantlinger has influentially argued, the quote, demise of savagery throughout the world, while often lamented in the form of what he calls proleptic elegy, was also often understood as necessary for social progress. In other words, and this is all to say, the cultural and political assimilation that Emerson saw as evolutionarily predetermined was, for those writing in the 19th century, still very tenuous and prospective. In Victorian writing about Hawaii, then, a prophetic confidence in the inevitability of progress runs up against a multitude of contradictory conceptions of how time works there. Hawaiians are simultaneously children of a younger growth, citizens of a modern liberal state, perpetual lotus-eating hedonists, and decadents in the twilight of their race. To the extent that this temporal confusion subverts the teleology of empire, and here I'm borrowing from Regina Gagne's and Dennis Denisov's respective formulations of decadence, I suggest that we can consider these disruptive temporalities in themselves decadent, even when we find them in work that lies far outside the bounds of the movement. So the essay version of this talk traces this decadent, what I'm calling kind of an anti-telos, across several 19th and early 20th century travel memoirs. But in the interest of time, I would focus here on one specific account, Stoddard's aforementioned Hawaiian life, serialized in part in the 1880s and completed and published in full in 1894. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Charles Warren Stoddard belonged to a circle of decadent adjacent bohemians based mostly in San Francisco. And he spent much of the 1870s and 1880s living in and writing about Hawaii for various American magazines. And chief among them was the Overland Monthly, which I think he co-edited at certain points in his career. His fascination with Polynesia was driven in part by what one historian fairly describes as his lifelong fetish for young men from the Pacific Rim, a fetish that drew him to a series of beautiful Hawaiian youths. And he talks about his affairs with these young men quite candidly in his memoirs. He also more famously had an ambiguously romantic friendship with the Japanese aesthetic poet Yone Noguchi. Stoddard's view of Hawaii as a queer sexual utopia also resonated with his polemical anti-capitalism, expressed most clearly in his depictions of plantation life in the company town of Sprecklesville on Maui, which was a sugar processing town. There, he writes, the steam plow is rampant and a forest of smokestacks rises over the town instead of trees. Progress, the ogre of the 19th century, progress with a precipitous P, is the war cry of Sprecklesville. In Hawaii, Stoddard saw a land resistant, albeit gradually succumbing, to the demoralizing grind of, quote, this modern civilization and its new diseases. As a victim to both proverbial and literal contagion, the fisherman Kanepihi becomes a focal point for Stoddard's critical reflections on modernity. Like many other Anglo-American writers, Stoddard projects onto Kanepihi's biography the story of his entire people, and in doing so naturalizes a collective doom that Stoddard fears is already accomplished. In that sense, Stoddard is making one of the classic maneuvers of what Brantlinger terms extinction discourse. So he's not only kind of presenting the individual native body as an exemplar of racial decline, but he's also assuming that that decline, that extinction is inevitable, can't be avoided at this point. But Stoddard also contests an ideology of progress that would lionize indigenous extinction as a noble and necessary sacrifice for the sake of development. Hawaiian Life introduces Kanepihi via a frame narrative that establishes the stakes of his story. Stoddard, unable to focus on a really boring book called Evidences of Christianity, takes a stroll on the beach where he stumbles upon a slim, sleek creature, unconscious, unclad, sprawled inartistically, absorbing sunshine and apparently steeped to the toes in it. On his first appearance, Kanepihi is not only primitive, but primordial, an amphibious manfish who amazes a smitten Stoddard with his prowess as a swimmer and diver. Stoddard's descriptions of Kanepihi, although often couched in the writer's habitual mythological register, are in substance Darwinian. Kanepihi is a perfect human animal, well adapted to a semi-aquatic niche and constitutionally unsuited to what Stoddard describes as the method and industry of the town. As such, Stoddard cheekily observes, he was doing what he could towards destroying the last vestiges of the evidences of Christianity. I would point out here how Stoddard inverts the logic of evolutionary anthropology. Kanepihi's sheer fitness elevates him in an alternative developmental scale, wherein Christianity and Western civilization more generally is relegated to the subordinate position of vestige, and it's a temporally subordinate position. In this hierarchy, it is the joyless regime of modern industry, not Kanepihi's savage, quote unquote, savage vitality, which belongs properly to the past. Things are quite different when Stoddard meets Kanepihi again, a decade later in real time, but a mere 5 pages further into Hawaiian life. During a chance visit to a local prison, Stoddard notices one inmate and inquires with the warden into the details of this man's life. Because this inmate's rural upbringing left him with, quote, no hope of development, Stoddard explains, the man might have lived in perpetual happiness if nature were to take her course. Instead, the man was, quote, seduced into the town and subsequently into a life of crime by a charismatic missionary. And this is Stoddard sort of retelling what the warden tells him about this particular inmate. At this point, Stoddard reveals that the prisoner is none other than my friend of yore, completely transformed by civilization, Kanepihi, the man-fish, out of his element. Importantly, Stoddard's elegy for Kanepihi defies the teleology that we find in, say, Emerson's folk history, or in other pro-imperialist accounts of indigenous precarity. The root cause of Kanepihi's downfall is not his incapacity to adjust to an uncongenial modernity. Indeed, before his capture, we are told, the man-fish had remade himself into, quote, one of the cleverest boys in town. Rather, Stoddard mourns the fact that this once perfect animal has adapted so well to modes of life structured around capitalist exploitation. Kanepihi's progression from exquisite waterman to consummate swindler, which Stoddard describes as a form of backsliding, makes a mockery of mainstream Eurocentric conceptions of development. As Stoddard puts it later, he, quote, passed too rapidly from the simplicity of the savage to the duplicity of civilized man. By muddling the temporal and moral dimensions of progress, Stoddard vacates Kanepihi's domestication and eventual death from smallpox of any redemptive purpose. He thus stakes his protest against US imperialism in the unruly decadent temporalities that had long haunted literary attempts to wrangle the islands into the progressive mainstream of history. As Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz points out, such consensual national narratives are an essential tool of the colonizer. In 19th century Anglo-American writing, I suggest, Hawaii's resistance to those narratives is registered in the decadent literary motif of temporal instability and breakdown, a motif that both draws on and works against imperialist understandings of cultural development grounded in contemporary anthropology. But ranged against this body of haole or foreign literature was a wealth of Olelo Hawai'i historiography, in which Kanaka Maoli historians articulated alternative national narratives in their own native language. With a few notable exceptions, the vast majority of this archive remains untranslated and thus inaccessible to scholars not fluent in Hawaiian, and in particularly in 19th century Hawaiian. This is not necessarily a problem that requires addressing. Literary scholar Ku'uloha Ho'omanawanui reminds us that in contrast to Western epistemologies premised on singular authority and expertise, traditional Kanaka Maoli ethics dictate a strong protocol of kapu, sacred, restricted, private, and noa, open, public. This ethic demands also a recognition of makavalu, multiple perspectives, and perhaps most importantly, kuleana, or responsibility. It is not my kuleana, as a non-fluent Kanaka Maoli researcher, to call upon Hawaiian studies scholars to do the work of translating more of this material. Neither is it appropriate to make claims about 19th century Hawaiian historiography based on the small segment of writing available in translation. But it would be remiss of me not to touch upon what little of this work has been translated, not to make a definitive argument about Hawaiian historiography, much less label it decadent, but to gesture toward the ways in which sociopolitical upheaval found expression there in similarly nonlinear representations of historical sequence. In the case of historian Samuel Kamakaw, this nonlinearity was so marked that it cast a long shadow on his posthumous reception. A judge and legislator, as well as a prolific journalist, Kamakaw contributed columns on Hawaiian history, religion, and folklore to various Hawaiian language newspapers until his death in 1876. Selections from his work were eventually translated and collected in 4 volumes published from the 1960s through the 1990s. As Puakea Nogelmeyer observes, Kamakaw's 20th century editors freely redacted, condensed, and reorganized his articles in order to lend, quote, continuity to a text that seemed to jump about in a Western sense. Translators also routinely simplified Kamakaw's use of tenses, usually shifting instances of the Hawaiian present tense into English past tense. This had the effect of displacing contemporary evolving Hawaiian cultural practices onto what Nogelmeyer describes as the timelessness of the distant past. But translation has not entirely occluded the temporal nuance of Kamakaw's work. In the snippets of his writing collected in Kapo'i Kahiko, People of Old, which was collected and published in 1964, the notoriously polemical Kamakaw utilizes historical comparison as grounds for timely cultural critique. At some junctures, the trajectory he draws is palpably decadent. Speaking of the disillusion of Hawaii's native caste system, Kamakaw asserts that the blood of lords has become mixed with the blood of kawa, or outcasts, and there is nothing that can cleanse it. Most of the spirits of this age are lying spirits, he remarks later, and the Aumakua, once helpful ancestral deities, have become bitter enemies who punish severely the faults of their descendants when they break a vow. He attributes this decadence in part to the moral complexities of life in a westernized modernity. Many, many more are the troubles of the Hawaiian race in these times as compared to times past, meaning that it is correspondingly more difficult to expiate their entangled wrongs and faults through traditional rituals. This narrative of irreparable rupture with an Edenic past meshes, to a degree, with Stoddard's decadent anti-modernism, and indeed with the interpretation of colonial history that would become known as the fatal impact thesis. At other moments, however, Kamakaw complicates this interpretation by calling into question Western fantasies of a pre-contact golden age. A zealous Christian convert, Kamakaw never depicts Western cultural influence as uniformly detrimental, and he analyzes Hawaii's ancient system of governance with measured ambivalence. His records abound with examples of so-called vile indigenous traditions that predate Cook's arrival. On the subject of ancient kanawai, or chiefly decrees, he observes, some kanawai were wicked edicts that put men to death and shed blood to please the bloodletting gods. Others were laws that benefited the people and the kingdom, and were laws superior to those of any other kingdom on earth. His judgments here rely on transhistorical and transnational comparison rather than a historicized scale of development, disclosing a view of Hawaiian history that is by turns cyclical, cataclysmic, and degenerative, but rarely, if ever, teleological. Crucially, too, that history is not calibrated against the timeline of European exploration. The moment of Western contact is merely one pivotal event among many. Again, Kamakaw's disruptive representations of time do not make his historiography necessarily decadent. As Ho'omanawanui, Noenoi K. Silva, David A. Chang, and others have argued, Kanaka Maoli writers such as Kamakaw belong to an independent intellectual tradition, one that sought to forge a distinct national identity by molding Western forms to indigenous worldviews. In the midst of our discipline's turn to the global, we should be conscientious about enlisting non-Western writers into Western canons, lest we erase the claims to distinctiveness that were key to those anti-colonial nation-building efforts. At the same time, and as scholars of the movement have demonstrated, decadence emerged from globe-spanning conversations about the shape of things to come, conversations in which colonial writers had a major stake. The challenge in tracing these conversations lies in teasing out their common terms without eliding the specificities of their interlocutors. I find Kamakaw's estrule of developmental hierarchy instructive in this regard. Placed alongside his English language contemporaries, he speaks to the pervasive entanglement of literary and anthropological discourses of decadence in this period, while also resisting the colonial logic that those discourses often empowered. Thank you. I will stop sharing now. I'll have a sip of water while you take a.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lindsay. Let me get my applause on here. There we go. Yeah, that was great. And there's so much to think about. So I think we're small enough that we can kind of pipe up and I don't need to call on people. I think I could start off just by asking in a general way about translation, because that was just interesting to me to think about, yes, in a theoretical sense, right, the politics of translation, but also just, some more information about like translation, like how many, like, are there scholars that, you could collaborate with who would translate some of these texts or have translated them? Like how, like, are they working in Hawaii? Like what's it all like? Like, what's the landscape?
Yeah, so the landscape, and I'm coming at this too as I don't want to say an interloper, but somewhat of an interloper, right? Because there is actually a very robust field of Hawaiian studies, and it's pretty much entirely it's headquartered, right, based at the University of Hawaii primarily. There is translation it's tricky because part of it is that there's just so much. There's a lot of Native Hawaiian or Aloha Hawai'i writing from the 19th century, and most of it was published in newspapers. There's some estimations that it can run into the millions of pages because there were so many newspapers being printed at the time. And so there's just a huge volume of stuff that's just like, it's impossible for one person to kind of work their way through. I have been in touch with a scholar in the English department at UH. He's actually a 19th century, he's a Victorianist, and he has been, in his time there, he's also he's getting a master's degree on the side in Hawaiian language, which he's been mostly, his master's thesis is a project wherein he's translated or attempted to identify Native Hawaiian translations of English language and French language texts, because a big chunk of what was in these newspapers were serialized translations of foreign language literature. So a lot of Arthurian legend was very popular. The sort of long penny dreadfuls, like Reynolds's work, was also very popular for translation. And so that's sort of what he's been doing as a Victorianist, like working in this archive. A lot of the work, some of the work that's being done in this archive, I'm thinking of like Noenoe Ke Silva. I mean, she does translate snippets as needed for her book or for her research, but for a lot of it, she's reading in the Hawaiian and sort of keeping it in the Hawaiian. And I definitely understand that impulse, right, to sort of maintain some of the linguistic integrity, I guess you could say, of the Hawaiian. It's made additionally difficult because a lot of this is in a particular form of Native Hawaiian that was being written in the 19th century. Hawaiian is very metaphorical. Most words mean multiple things at any given time. It can really change the meaning of the text, and so it also requires tons and tons of cultural literacy, right? So that's one. That's sort of why a lot of this work is being based there among scholars who have done most of their training there. And so far I've been trying to keep myself mostly to stuff that's been translated into English by others, also some Hawaiian writing that was written in English originally.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. I wonder if you could put this into the maybe the larger context of the rest of your work and how, I'm just curious about what it's connecting to in your mind in bigger ways.
Yeah. Okay. So this I feel a bit like that with that meme where you're sort of drawing the red lines between all the between all the different evidence, sort of a little bit of a paranoid thing. So my main book project, just I was telling Susan earlier, is under review and it's actually gotten 2 positive readers reports. So hopefully we're going to move forward on that one. Is really almost completely based in Britain. It's about the intersections of evolutionary science and aestheticism. And in particular there, I'm looking at ways in which evolutionary science fed into and also drew on a fairly, you might want to say kind of optimistic strain of aestheticism in which artists or sort of taste in beauty was seen to be a kind of mechanism for social and cultural progress. And so I'm thinking of that as kind of a little bit of a corrective to some of the readings of fin de siècle, particularly Decadence, as being inherently pessimistic. So part of what I was interested in this project, the sort of second strain of my work, you could say, has to do with a kind of I don't want to say a kind of flip side, but a kind of flip side to what's going on in some of the aesthetic and scientific writing that I'm looking at in the first project, wherein science is being applied to this idea of kind of perpetual progress without end that's going to operate through a kind of cultural, acculturation, right? A particular acquisition of a particular temperament or taste. And so this sort of I was kind of interested in the second body of work on the Victorian Pacific for 2 reasons. One is that I'm from Hawaii. So I've always kind of been interested in the 19th century Hawaiian monarchy, especially how they, in some ways, performed a kind of Britishness, right, in order to shore up their legitimacy on the global stage in particular. But also because, again, it's representing, I'm sort of interested in what's maybe being left out or left behind in some of that more kind of optimistic, kind of progressive scientific aesthetic discourse that I'm looking at in the first book project. That book project almost, for instance, I mentioned this in the introduction to that project, is that it does not really engage that much with race, because most of the writers that I'm looking at weren't that interested in talking about it. So this is sort of, again, my kind of like pivot or kind of correction, a kind of pendulum swing to this topic. But as you can see in this particular talk, I am still interested in ways in which like the scientific understandings of progress and how it works.
I mean, just to piggyback on that, I think it's like I've always kind of conceptualized decadence as a sort of counter modernity. Mm-hmm. It's fetishizing the others of Enlightenment progress, mm-hmm. As far as it has, like, you know, racialized preoccupations, mm-hmm. for example, like in Stoddard's, you know, objectification of Kanepihi. Mm-hmm. You know, that's the vein of it. It's celebratory and fascinated and so on. I think it's such an important and interesting move to then kind of like think about that formation in light of, you know, indigenous writers, mm-hmm. and how they would engage with it, because mm-hmm. it broadens the, you know, the very limited dyad of, like, you know, racial discourse in mm-hmm. Britain. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So
this is what I mean. That's sort of the turn to Komikow in this piece, right? In particular because I felt like I had to. I would say I was a little bit conflicted, right, about including him in this particular essay, in part because, again, so actually, like the published and translated works of his are like a fairly small selection of everything that he had written. As Nogelmeyer points out, there's some things that get lost in translation or actively changed, right, in an attempt to bring the writing more in line with what was seen to be a real kind of rigorous history, which is always linear, right, in its presentation. That's not how he wrote it when he was writing his columns for the newspapers. Also, I mean, there's a question, there's a I don't know if this is a problem, but it's an issue, right? That he's one of, I would say, 3 Hawaiian historians who, for various reasons, partly because they were just very prolific, have had their work translated at the sort of to the detriment of potentially many other writers who were writing at the same time. And then Noble talks about this sort of influencing the way that people think that history was written, because we've only been reading like the 3 people who have been translated into English. So I was a little bit conflicted, but at the same time, so much of this, sort of Olelo Hawai'i writing from the 19th century is history writing, right? So it seemed like I couldn't not engage with the Hawaiian historiography, at least just a little bit, as and then when I was looking into it, I mean, because I was struck by the way in which history and time are being invoked in that particular tradition. So there's that. I've also like written a little bit about, I have a different piece that is in press, I believe, and as part of a Cambridge collection on the 1890s. And it's about dandyism in Hawaii in the 1880s and 1890s. And so that looks at the Hawaiian language stuff, and the Hawaiian writing it's looking at is primarily by Native Hawaiians in English, right? So then I don't have to really deal with the sort of issues of translation. But one of the texts that I look at is a kind of canonical classic of Hawaiian writing, which is Lydia Liliuokalani's memoir, Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen. And what I'm so struck by that in that book, many things, but one is the way in which she invokes a kind of nostalgia, not just for a kind of Hawaiian history or Hawaiian kind of pre-modern social organization, but also for a British one. So there is quite a bit of the book is actually about her visit to Britain for Victoria's Jubilee. I think a solid 10 chapters are dedicated to that trip. And one of the things she talks about quite a bit is this visit to this estate, this sort of old country estate that she sees as actually, and it is kind of a decadent kind of image. She says that it used to be a place where, you know, the lord and lady of the manor had this kind of almost affective, kind of emotional attachment to their tenants. And now the lord of Clifton, you know, goes to London to work at the bank every day, right? And so like something has been lost kind of in that transition to modernity. So there's a kind of anti-modern, like modernism there too. And I always find it interesting when they're sort of lensing it through a kind of European sensibility, and as well as a Hawaiian one.
I guess I could jump in with a question. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
It's really super fascinating. And I got excited when you started talking about Liliuokalani's book, and I'm very interested in questions of gender, and I wondered if you've come across in English translation or not any perspectives by women that are maybe less famous.
Yeah, that is a good question. I have not, because I don't know. I mean, so many of the writers who I think, I mean, again, I don't want to speak from a position of expertise because I don't know for sure. My instinct, or what I've read so far, is that a lot of the Native Hawaiian writers who were writing for newspapers were men. So yeah, actually I don't have an answer for you, unfortunately. There's a lot of interesting gender stuff going on in some of the writing, but it's still vastly, for the most part, from a masculine perspective. Is this one of the texts that your student is working on?
Yeah. So I'm interested in this question too about, because we're thinking about, decolonizing the Western archive and strategies to do that. What do you do when there doesn't seem to be, the archival materials that you really desperately wish were there? You sort of thought about that at all, about like other ways, like where are other materials available that might be able to give the voices that we wish we could hear? Kind of a big question, but I just want
to be working on it. I mean, and this is one of the things that I kind of run up against, right, is I don't want to say the paucity of the archive, because again, the 19th century Native Unlikalila Hawaii archive is actually really vast. It's just mostly inaccessible to anyone who's not really hyper fluent, right, in a particular form of Hawaiian. And so, yeah, so I find myself kind of running up against it as a potential kind of delimiting thing. So, I mean, like sometimes I actually think like maybe I should just, stop, right? That there are people sort of looking into this archive and they have the expertise that I don't. And so it's at one point I might just want to just say like, this is where I kind of stop trying to kind of find something, right? If all I'm doing is sort of trying to, so I'll just put it, I'll put it that way. Sometimes I lie in bed and think like, maybe I should just not do this project. That might be just better to leave it to somebody else. But at the same time, I mean, first of all, you don't want to make the perfect enemy of the good. And then you also don't want to not engage with this material, at least to acknowledge that it's there. So some of what I see my role as especially within Victorian studies, because there is such interest, right, in trying to expand the canon, trying to find Indigenous voices, right, that are surely out there, right, but also trying to like sort of engage with them in a scholarly and analytical way. One of the things that I think is my role in some ways is to just point out the existence of some of these texts, right, or this archive, and to say, that it is there and that these are some of the people who work on it, and to in some ways sort of shunt people toward them as opposed to me, right? Especially because Hawaiian studies is so localized that it's again like it's a robust field, but a lot of it is like happening in a particular geographic region, and it's not always as kind of we're not talking to each other maybe as much as we should in some ways. So it's not a very satisfying answer, but
no, I mean it's important though, and it's illuminating to hear, sort of what goes through your head as you're engaging with this research. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer, and it's always helpful too to hear that other people have those thoughts of, should I even be doing this? Maybe, and I hope that we're moving towards a place in academia where we can feel more open to be reflective about our own positionality and so much more. But so I found that a really helpful answer.
Oh, good. Yeah, and like again, I can only speak for myself that part of this came out. I mean, a lot of this project came out in part. Well, I will sort of be fairly frank in the spirit of transparency. It came about because there was a NAPSA in Honolulu, like that might have been the 2016, 2015 NAPSA, maybe. I was still a graduate student. So I presented there on, in fact, Olivia Okoloni's memoir, including a couple other things, some travel literature. And that ended up in a Routledge collection. And so it kind of, well, first of all, it got me interested in these types. I had always been interested in 19th-century Hawaii, in part, I mean, mostly just the fascination with just how kind of, in some ways, Victorian-esque, right, the royal family was, right, and like intentionally, in a sort of strategic way. But also, I mean, that sort of also kind of got other people interested in me as like a person who does this kind of work, right? So then I've sort of been kind of pulled along in some ways in this field, and there's a lot to be done for sure. But yeah, I do sometimes, again, just speaking for myself, sometimes think like maybe I try to delimit in my writing as much as possible my area of expertise in sort of in the spirit of kuleana and responsibility.
I have a kind of another sort of big field kind of orientation question. It makes obvious sense to talk about Hawaii in relation to the United States and Britain. But like, is there also a way that it fits into, I don't know, like a Pacific kind of constellation that goes eastward or southward? and or like, I don't know, island studies or other kinds of organizing rubrics, I guess.
Yeah, there's certainly, and I think there's definitely a kind of trans-Pacific, cross-Pacific kind of strain within Hawaiian studies that is looking at it kind of comparatively within Polynesia as a whole, and also oriented toward the East. I mean, in the period that I'm interested in, which is the 19th century, I mean, one of the things that I am fascinated by is the way in which, particularly under the reign of Liliuokalani's brother, her predecessor was Kalakaua. He had a kind of concerted policy and a vision of Hawaii as actually the linchpin, the capital of a kind of pan-Pacific empire that would be a kind of analogous or a kind of power broker in the Pacific, in opposition to particularly British, American, French, and also German kind of colonial power in Samoa. And he had actually dispatched several warships and diplomats in an attempt to create some kind of compact, I think a kind of confederacy, I think is how he thought of it. And so he had definite imperial ambitions in the Pacific, and those did also include establishing close familial ties with Japan. So at some point he attempted to negotiate a kind of arranged political marriage, right, between members of the Hawaiian royal family and members of the imperial Japanese family. So there were a lot of those things are going on in the 19th century, and I'm interested in them historically. I'm also interested in the way in which he presents them in his writing. He has a collection of folklore that definitely kind of leverages the Japanese connection a bit. There's a story in there that mentions it's a myth that he's rewriting. There was a kind of, I guess there's something in the oral tradition where supposedly there was a shipwreck in Hawaii before contact that was actually from Japan. So he writes part of the story into and mentions the Japanese shipwreck, people being integrated into the Hawaiian community and actually intermarrying with them and everything like that. So there's sort of interesting, it comes out in interesting ways, at least in the period that I'm interested in.
Thanks, that's fascinating. Okay, did anyone want to jump in with a last question, perhaps?
I will, so I'll for the recording, my email is lindsay.wilhelm@gmail.com. It's just my first and last name. So if anybody watching the recording has questions or comments or anything like that, they should feel free to contact me.
Yeah, thank you very much for offering that. And I'm sure people will avail themselves of it. You've been very kind to kind of talk, openly about your, your practice and the projects and, your positionality in the scholarship and all of it. So.
Yeah, I've been trying to do that more especially with this body of work, right? I think it's important to recognize one's positionality or perspective on this material.
Yeah, for sure. And helpful not just for graduate students to, think about that while they're crafting their projects, but also for faculty and like everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much also for inviting me. This was lovely.
Thank you. Thank you for being game and dealing with the low attendance due to this.
That's fine. No, it was very intimate. It was very low key, low stress. That's if we can get that, that's perfect.
Cool. Well, thanks again. And thanks everyone for coming, and see you all down the road.
Yeah. Good luck everybody with your last week of the quarter.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.